Welcome to A Push. Today we're going to be discussing the end of the era of good feelings. So, without further ado, here are your objectives for today. Take a moment and process them. And let's talk about how the supposed unity of political parties that existed in the aftermath of the War of 1812 finally broke down. So, the main disagreements are about a series of economic and political concepts, sort of known as Commonwealth Society. It's basically the idea that the government, if you believe in Commonwealth society, you believe that the government has some motivation to create common assets to benefit everyone. So, for example, should a town build a communal well for all, or a communal well to provide water, or a communal mill to allow all of its people to grind their grain into flour, or a common road? To what extent do all people have some benefit from these common assets? And so, to what extent should the government facilitate that versus to what extent should all of these things be privately financed? If this sounds like a familiar argument that we're still having today, it's because it is. And just like today, people come down all over the political spectrum as far as what they believe the role of government should be in providing benefits for its citizens. So, turnpikes are sort of a middle path, of course, because they do provide a user fee and theoretically are supposed to pay for themselves. But there's still significant upfront costs that have to be put forward. And canals were even more expensive. And so, if you weren't directly benefiting from the canal, several people in certain regions of the country started to become increasingly hostile to these growing infrastructural projects because they were paying huge amounts of money in taxes for them and weren't necessarily seeing an individual personal benefit. In general, this Commonwealth Society, or this version of Commonwealth Society, is known as the American system, and it was articulated by Henry Clay, our Western triumvir. It's pretty straightforward. The policy, so you get a protective tariff in order to finance all of this. The protective tariff both protects American industry and then creates money that's then used for transportation and canals. This then leads to industrial growth in the North, and the infrastructure allows those goods to be shipped to the West and Western raw materials to be brought back in. It's basically creating a sort of pseudo mercantilist industrial system within the American continent. And of course, there's a national bank there to help finance and collect all those tariffs. And it's connecting together the South, the West, and the North. This was unequal, was not popular in all regions of the country. Obviously, Henry Clay in the West, for the most part, supported it because this infrastructure was absolutely essential for the economic growth of the West. And people in the North, shown here by Daniel Webster, also for the most part supported it because they were the ones who were benefiting from the manufactured goods and from the raw materials coming in. The problem is the people in the South. Because since the South has a lot of deep, easily navigable rivers, they didn't get the same level of infrastructure built. And because the South is mostly exporting goods to Europe and then to some extent the North along the coast, they worried about the protective tariff, which would simply increase the price of Southern goods. That's why you see John C. Calhoun here representing the South, referring to Henry Clay's American system as a humbug. And I apologize for the harsh language there. Eventually, you end up getting another factor that led to the breakdown of political unity was the growth of slavery. Henry Clay is known as the Great Compromiser, and he brokered what's known as the Missouri Compromise in 1820 to divide up the country into to divide up the territories into slave territories or free territories. Specifically, they were targeting, of course, Missouri, which the state of Missouri was south or sort of south of the Ohio River, but there was a significant growth of slave plantations there, and so there was a question of should Missouri be grandfathered into the whole banning of slavery in the Northwest Territory, or should it be a new slave territory? And what they came up with is Missouri would be a slave territory, but this parallel, the 3630 line, would then ban slavery from the rest of the Louisiana Purchase. So you've got now Missouri as the last northern-ish slave territory, but all of this land would be closed to slavery. And the Missouri Compromise started the pattern of bringing in a free state and a slave state at the same time. So, for example, the state of Missouri was brought in as a slave state, whereas the state of Maine was carved out of Massachusetts and brought in as a free state. This equal number of free and slave states kept the balance of power in the Senate equal, which was incredibly important because the population of the northern states was growing significantly faster than the population of the southern states, and therefore the North had already had most control of the House of Representatives. And so the South was worried about moving into political irrelevancy, which they might have if they hadn't come up with this idea of bringing states in pairs in order to keep the balance of power in the Senate and make sure that the South could check anything that the North wanted to do that was against their interests. The election that most led to the breakdown of the era of good feelings was the election of 1824, which is one of the first elections in American history where there were absolutely no political parties. There were four candidates that were somewhat had a potential chance to win. And we see them here running a race, which this is the first political cartoon that depicted running for office as a race and gave us a lot of the language that we use. And so we've got four candidates. You've got Henry Clay back here, who doesn't really stand a chance, unfortunately for him. You've got Andrew Jackson, the hero of New Orleans, running. You have John Quincy Adams, the Secretary of State. And then you have William Crawford, who was a Southerner who doesn't really matter because halfway through the campaign, he's going to have a stroke and become irrelevant. So with no actual national candidate and no parties, we get this hot mess, which you should definitely pause and take a moment to take all this in. But what's noteworthy here is a couple things. Obviously, Jackson gets a plurality of both the popular and the electoral vote. So he is the most popular candidate. But hopefully, as you remember from the election of 1800, if no one has a majority of the electoral vote, it gets thrown back into the House of Representatives. And so when the House of Representatives will only consider the top three candidates, so now it's down to these three guys. So the question is, where do Clay's voters go? And the answer is to John Quincy Adams, which for Jackson supporters seemed unbelievably corrupt and unfair. Because now John Quincy Adams, a guy who, as you remember, only got 32% of the electoral vote, has now become president of the United States. And in what people saw as a massive corrupt, what they called the corrupt bargain, John Quincy Adams then appoints Henry Clay Secretary of State, which at the time, the position of Secretary of State was seen as the jumping off point for the presidency. So the union of John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay was seen by Jackson supporters as the, quote, corrupt bargain, and was seen as like basically stealing an election through shady politicking. So John Quincy Adams becomes president in not the best of situations. Here's John Quincy Adams, the first time that a son succeeds his father in the presidency eventually. And honestly, he probably would have been an okay president. He was very, very experienced in both foreign and domestic policy, and he pretty much pushed most of Monroe's policies and tried to get the American system passed. But the political vitriol created from the election of 1824 prevented John Quincy Adams from getting much done because Jackson and his supporters more or less threw a wrench in anything that John Quincy Adams tried to do. And so despite being one of America's greatest statesmen, he was not a successful president. In fact, the only thing that he got passed was an incredibly high tariff in order to protect domestic industry and, of course, create funds for infrastructure projects that was dubbed the Tariff of Abominations by the South and became one of the key foundations of the building of the Jacksonian coalition, which is going to become incredibly important here in the future. The tariff wasn't unpopular in all areas, but obviously in the South, they were incredibly against it. But these Western states, which would benefit from infrastructure, were for it. But the merchants of New England were very, very sort of split on it. So the Tariff of Abominations is going to be a major sticking point here going forward. Here we see an anti-Tariff of Abomination political cartoon where Northern bankers are getting fat, whereas Southern plantation owners are poor and skinny, I guess. I don't know. This leads to the creation of the second party system because it's pretty obvious to everyone that these political parties, having no political parties doesn't work. You need to build some sort of broad coalition or else we're just going to have repeated elections get thrown into the House of Representatives. And then, Henry Clay is going to come away with some shady negotiated deal. So you get a political union between the South and the West. Whereas Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams represent a Northwest coalition, Andrew Jackson and John C. Calhoun represent a Southwest coalition that is now going to challenge those Northerners and pro infrastructure Westerners for control of the government. And so this is again the birth of modern party politics. The creation of this new party, the Democratic Party, which broke away from the Republican Party, was mostly the brainchild of this man here. This is Martin Van Buren of New York. He's known as the Little Magician because he created the modern sort of political machine. And he's going to create a bunch of different systems by which the Democrats are going to use to gain power. So, for example, he's going to create the political ticket, or the idea that they create these pre-printed ballots that list all of the candidates that have a similar set of ideologies. And so you're tying down ballot candidates to the party leader in order to sort of push their bona fides and get people more excited about voting for them. They also expand party newspapers. Martin Van Buren's Albany Regency had a very, very widely circulated partisan newspaper. And so we're going to return to sort of the Jeffersonian / Federalist partisan newspapers. And we're going to see a significant expansion of these. We're also going to see the beginning of something called a party platform, which is a series of issues that tie all of the candidates in the party together to make sure that everyone knows what they sort of speak for. These things seem integral to our political system at this point, but until Martin Van Buren introduced them in New York, they actually were not common nor widespread. And we get the idea of party discipline, creating the position of a party whip, whose goal it is to ensure that everyone in the party votes for the same things and that you don't have party members going off and doing their own thing. So once you build a political coalition, you can then make sure you can actually do stuff with it. All of these are part of this new Democratic Party that's going to revolutionize American politics. We also, with this whole thing, get the idea of celebrity in American politics, voting for people not because they're well-known politicians, but because they're heroes or have made their name doing something else. So the hero of New Orleans, Andrew Jackson, is of course very, very well known, and see he's going to become the figurehead for the Democratic Party. And especially popular generals are going to be political figures going forward. So a rising star in American politics is William Henry Harrison, the hero of Tippecanoe and the governor of Indiana Territory. And so he's going to be an important political figure going forward. So that brings us through all the things that broke up the era of good feelings. Take a moment and make sure you can answer these questions in a somewhat substantive way. And when we come back next time, we're going to be talking about the rise of the Democrat.